Hi, everyone. I'm David Becker with the Pew Charitable Trusts. I just want to say first how grateful we are to be able to join with the University of Chicago and the Joyce Foundation on this important event, and hopefully to continue the important work of the Presidential Commission to improve how elections are run in the United States. I am now going to introduce the next session, which is the only thing standing between you and lunch. So hopefully it will go well. First, I'm going to introduce a video created by my good friend and colleague Doug Chapin, who's the director for the program in elections for elections and excellence in election administration, rather, at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, and a former colleague of mine from the Pew Trust as well, who's been working in this field for so long. He couldn't be with us today, but as I think most of you in the room know, those of you who know Doug know that if someone's talking about professionalism in election administration or data in election administration, Doug is there at least in spirit, and he's been pushing these issues since way before they were cool. So with that, I'm going to introduce this brief video, and then we'll go on to our next panel.
Election administrators are part of what I like to call the accidental profession. There are very few people around the country who woke up when they were 18, 22, 30 and said, I want to be an election official when I grow up. Election administration tends to be incredibly localized, and since it really is often handed down in almost an oral tradition from official to official, I don't think many election officials, even in big cities or counties, have an appreciation of how what they do fits into how other people across the country do their job. When I talk about professionalizing election administration, what I'm looking to do is to create that common educational path, that common language, that common ethical approach to the job, really a sense of community that individual election officials, no matter where they are in the country, feel that they're a part of and feel some loyalty to above their loyalty to their own community. In 2011, I got an opportunity to come to the University of Minnesota to work with them on a new project aimed at identifying, recruiting, and training the next generation of election officials across the country. I would like to have a degree and a certificate program here so that if there are young people or not so young people who wake up one morning and decide they want to be an election official when they grow up, that there is a place for them to go and not just learn it on the job or through osmosis. The success of the profession depends on development of a network of schools with faculty and students and researchers sharing ideas and sharing personnel to help both existing election administrators and wannabes, if you will. What's important in bringing new folks into the field is really, there are really two big approaches. I think the first is to broaden public perception of what an election official is and what an election official does. The other avenue, quite honestly, is to look for communities that are not well represented in the process. We hear a lot of talk about the need to reach out to voters with disabilities or voters whose primary language is other than English, or traditionally underrepresented communities of color. I think that we can create opportunities for all voters if we identify young and mid-career people in those communities as well to become election officials.
Okay, well, thank you, Doug, for that. Again, great words on professionalizing this field. We're fortunate to have many of those professionals who epitomize those qualities here today. I'm going to introduce the next panel, which is we're going to discuss polling place management right before lunch. With that, I'll have the panelists come on up, and I'll just introduce you as you come on up. First, a couple of local election officials that we at Pew have been very fortunate to work with, who I think are emblematic of the very finest in this field. First, Pam Anderson, County Clerk from Jefferson County, Colorado, who has done remarkable work as we at Pew and others have worked in Colorado. She's the go-to resource for how elections are best run in a challenging county like Jefferson County. And similarly, David Orr from right here in Illinois, the clerk from Cook County, who has always been, in my experience, someone who is thinking about addressing the next problem, trying to solve the next problem before it becomes a problem, and is one of those who's truly innovative in this field. And then at the end, Professor Charles Stewart from MIT, perhaps which one of these things is not like the other on this panel, who is not an election official, but has been at the forefront of using data in elections. We work with him very closely on Pew's Elections Performance Index, which is an objective assessment of how states are performing in election administration. If you haven't gone to it and seen it before, you can find it at pewstates.org/EPI. And Charles is the brains behind that whole operation. So if it's something you like, definitely give Charles a pat on the back for that. And then finally, I think Robin Carnahan, the great former Secretary of State of Missouri, will be moderating this panel. Probably needs no further introduction. So with that, I'll hand it off.
Excellent. Well, thank you, David. Are we on? Okay, so this is going to be super exciting. We're going to keep you all not hungry. If you are really hungry, grab a bite and come back. So long lines, polling place management, as we talked about this morning, that was sort of one of the basic impetus for the Presidential Commission report in the first place. So I'm really pleased to have both an academic and some real practitioners here. I want to do a quick survey, though, before we get started. How many of you voted before Election Day in the last November election? All right, so a lot. How many voted on Election Day? A little fewer.
Not too many.
How many, I voted on Election Day. How many people who voted on Election Day, how many voted by mail? Let me ask that first. Okay. How many of those of you who voted in a polling station witnessed some kind of problem? Oh, wow. And were those, give me feedback. Was it a line? Was it a poll worker issue? Was it a machine issue? What? Come on, talk. Line? Long line for Nate? Jeff?
Broken machine, confusion about registration, location.
Yeah.
Line.
Okay.
Confusion about polling place, and I'm from Chicago, and part of the problem was the Chicago elections website was down on election.
Yeah. Okay. Over here.
Didn't have the right residents to register a day.
Got it. Yep.
There was a lot of confusion about language access.
Yep. Okay. Anybody else? So we had, what, half a dozen people who personally witnessed some issues. So I try to do this because people's ideas about elections and how well they're run tend to be really informed by personal experience, right? And the experience of people that they know. So it's very anecdotal. And there's a big disparity. And most of the people in the room, you didn't see any problems or have any problems, and it seemed to, go okay. But there are some that have problems. And so what we're talking about with all of this is how you reduce these disparities and make it a better experience for everyone across the board. I want to start with Charles, because the question is this indicative? Mm-hmm. And can you tell us a little bit about your research? Like, are lines really a problem?
Right. So thanks, Robin. But before answering the question, I want to, like everyone else who's been up here, thank the organizers, our sponsors up here, and Joyce for organizing this event. It's been a really exciting and interesting day. And the other thing I would say by way of introduction and answering the question is that I think it's an interesting segue moving from talking about voting technology to talking about polling places, because 12 years ago when we had the problems with the 2000 election, the focus there was on
14 years ago.
14 years ago, I'm sorry, 14 years ago when at the 2000 election. Well, time flies, right? In the 2000 election, the focus there that got a lot of national attention was things like hanging Chad and other problems with voting machines. And we've been working on that problem. We worked on that problem right away. And although there continue to be issues with voting machines, I think it's important to note that given a national concerted effort to deal with the voting machine problems, in any given presidential election, there's anywhere between 1 and 1.5 million votes that are counted that would not have been counted had we not dealt with that problem. But there were other problems in addition to voting machines. There were problems of voter registration systems, which we've talked about already, and there were problems with polling place practices. And so just to say a few things that are really at the 30,000-foot level, but I think can provide some context to the more particular discussion we'll have today. The first point I would make, and this is based on research I've been doing over the last several federal elections, surveying tens of thousands of voters about their experience voting, is the first thing we need to remember is that problems at the polling places, lines are the most significant, but the other problems that were mentioned here are costly, invoke costs, produce costs in elections, and the cost can be seen in various ways. Thing number one is that we know from public opinion surveys that between 500,000 and 750,000 of Americans walk away from the polling place and don't vote because of long lines and other problems. Okay, that's not as bad as the old voting machines problems, but it's in the same ballpark. So hundreds of thousands of people end up not voting because of problems in the polling places. Problems in the polling places reduce confidence in the voting process and system. When we talk to people who experience long lines especially, which ends up being the main problem that people say they experience, when they experience long lines, they are less likely to say they are confident that their vote was counted as cast. That's not surprising, but they are also less likely to say that votes in their state and nationwide were counted as cast, which has significant effects in states like Florida, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland that have had chronic line problems. So there's a problem of voter confidence that underlines the legitimacy of elections. And finally, and this is a bit of a whimsical note, but I think it bears some thinking about, waiting in line and other problems actually have monetary costs. By my calculations, for instance, excessive waiting in the 2012 election had a shadow cost of about $500 million in waiting time among voters. It looks like it costs local jurisdictions between $1 and $2 billion to administer elections. So just the waiting time itself by voters ends up being a significant cost. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say on how, directly to answer the question, are the problems that people reported here, are they common? The first thing to say is no, they're not actually. That most voters, when you ask them, did you have a problem on election day? Can you rate your polling place? Roughly 80 to 90% of them will say the polling place was run really, really well. A third of voters say they waited no time at all to vote. 2/3 say they waited less than 10 minutes to vote. And 80% meet the commission's standard of waiting 30 minutes or less. Okay? But there are the people who wait very long times, and the people who wait for long times, say more than an hour, wait exceptionally long times. The average wait time for someone, and this is about 5% of the electorate, who wait more than an hour, those people on average are waiting 2 hours to vote. Okay? And those are the visible problems. So I will just kind of end with some other sort of fun facts to know and tell, and we can move on. But there are some kind of well-known kind of correlates with these problems. Cities have greater problems than rural areas. African Americans and Hispanic voters wait longer than white voters. Early voters wait longer than election day voters. And so these things are very well known. But again, it turns out that for most African Americans, the wait time is short. For most Hispanics, the wait time is short. For most city dwellers, the wait time is short. So the trick in dealing with the problems is to try to figure out ways to drill down to those particular places that have the problems and to diagnose them. And that's where most of today is about talking with local election officials, and that's really where I think we need folks like me and academics need to be working with local election officials, because the issues and the problems are very specific to polling places and sometimes down to the individuals working in polling places, and we need to understand that better.
So let me just do a quick follow-up on that, because so you're suggesting that it's less of these polling place management issues, it's less of a policy failure that we can change policy to fix,
Right.
and it's more of an operational failure. Is that the suggestion?
Well, I think it's both, and I think that one of the things that we need to do in order to move from just kind of horror at long lines to making progress is to understand the times when it is a policy problem and times when it is an operational problem. For instance, I think in Florida, they've come to the conclusion in the state that one source of lines in Florida was shortening their early voting time, and they've extended it back out. So that's a policy issue. But there's also operational issues as well, which are harder to get at. But this has to do not only with making sure you have enough polling places and machines and things like that, but making sure that you have a room where people can actually walk around and not have to scooch to get between voting machines and things like that. It's really the details that probably are explaining the problems and the real meltdowns when we see them reporting.
Well, so given this, and given that elections are essentially run by volunteers, right? If my state's any example, the average age of the poll workers, and we have about 20,000 that run the elections on election day. We have about 4 million voters. So 20,000 nearly volunteer poll workers come in, average age 72. The rules are changing all the time. The technology is being updated all of the time. Voters are impatient, and if one thing goes wrong, it gets tweeted about. You're a local election official. You get to deal with all of those essentially volunteers that have had a couple hours of training on all of this new stuff and a lot more scrutiny. Does what Charles say ring true to you in your experience?
Thank you for having me to Chicago. Beautiful. Colorado's beautiful too, but Chicago's beautiful last couple of days.
David will tell you it's always like this.
Yeah, don't come in February.
Yeah, I think a lot of that rings true for me as a local election official, and some of the challenges that we have that you've described exist, I think, almost universally in local election jurisdictions. And our job and I really appreciate the theme of this is public administration. That's how we look at it. We are providing a service to our electorate, to our citizenry. And looking at each election, both prospectively and retrospectively, and how to refine that and get better. So one of the things that we do in Colorado, and then more specifically in Jefferson County, is we assess where we're going to hold our elections, where we're going to have our polling places. We have our routine ADA audits from the state level. But we're also looking at those things where we're going into the location and you're talking about the flow. You're trying to identify exactly what that voter's experience is going to be from start to finish. Where, if line forms, will that go? How many pieces of equipment do you need? And one of the very key components of that and the theme in elections is human behavior, right? Trying to predict human behavior, which is a big challenge. So you're looking at, if you're a precinct polling place jurisdiction, who voted in a like election previously. In Colorado, we have a new election model that we've evolved towards. We're doing all of the same things we've done over the years, but we'll be delivering a mail ballot to every eligible voter, and then going completely to vote centers from 2 weeks before through election day. So it's like, I guess the best way to describe it is like an early voting experience through election day. So you can vote at any polling place in a county jurisdiction. How are we going to predict who's going to show up where? So in our state statute, there's criteria for assessment. What are the transportation corridors? Where do people commute? We will be using GIS mapping to identify who voted provisionally in my precinct polling place the last election, right? Because they needed an address change. Where did they go? What was their natural draw? Those are the things that you want to do when you're managing and preparing. And then finally, the human element regarding the judges. Elections are complex. They're getting more and more complex. And recruiting is a challenge from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Sometimes the policy tells us who our judges are, who you have to choose as your judges from the parties, how many. So what kind of training, what kind of skill set do they have? In Colorado, our voting experience is going to start with computers, right? Not a paper poll book. So that's going to be a big challenge, and refining that training and identifying that skill set. E-poll books. And ours is a statewide system, so we'll be able to validate that voter and make their change, as well as same-day registration, update their address. So a lot of these discussions we've had through this day is we are reliant on for our success, and we're looking for those tools. Good list maintenance techniques, identifying our voters early, encouraging them to come early. Why wait in line on election day? So those are just a few things that we'll be looking at.
Okay. Well, David, you run the elections and have for a long time in one of the big urban counties. And so presumably it's one of those places where there's a big difference between a presidential year, general election vote, and other elections. And you've got tons of resources that you've got to figure out how to allocate on election day effectively. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's got to be a huge part of what you do.
It's a lot of fun. First, I want to let you know I'm going to add to my resume the accidental professional administrator. I think that's good. Secondly, I want to compliment the group. We were probably in a good 2.5 hours before anyone made fun of Cook County and dead voting. So
No,
that's,
David did that. David did that at the very beginning.
oh, well, that's okay. So that's too bad. So, okay, so we're talking nuts and bolts here. And the nuts and bolts is, how do we allocate all these resources? Pam touched on some of it. So, okay, you've got this massive election. You might have 1 million voters. You might have 10, 20,000 judges, maybe 1,800 polling places. Anyway, you got lots of stuff. And so the key to us is, again, using tools now, and people like Charles help with that, using tools for all administrators, small jurisdictions and large, one, so we can predict what we think is going to happen election day. And we have all sorts of tools to do that, to predict turnout. We have something called a density map. We want to examine where there's going to be contested races versus uncontested races. Makes a big difference in turnout. Examining where the hot races are. Hot races might change things a lot. You might need an extra poll worker. You might want your rover to pay attention there, because in this particular precinct, they're always fighting outside the polling place as to who can get closer to pass out the literature. So part of it is you're evaluating stuff all year long. You're evaluating stuff before the election. You're doing analysis election day, and you're evaluating afterwards, because you're always looking to find out what can we do about that particular precinct. The most important thing for us on election day, and I probably should point out something, we're probably more fortunate than some in terms of affecting lines, because we have pre-election voting. We have early voting, which is extremely popular now, and we have mail voting, which most people don't fully understand in Illinois, but everybody can vote early. Those things help us. The other thing that helps us, at least in Cook, is the voters have a choice between voting on an electronic machine or voting on paper. That can be very handy if there's any kind of problem in the polling place. The key to us on election day, again, is another tool. We call it here in Cook the automated call form. You've got thousands of people involved. You've got a lot of layers. Okay, we got a call center with 75 expertly trained people that take calls. You've got another several hundred people taking calls in your main headquarters. You've got these thousands of poll workers. You've got hundreds, perhaps, of attorneys or rovers, other people out there. The automated call form, online information that tracks everything, ideally everything. It's so critical, because with those limited resources on a big election day, the last thing you want is, well, here there's a problem in precinct X, and all of a sudden we've got Jonathan rushing over there, and we've got the various rovers running over there, and 3 attorneys and so forth. And so the automated call form can tell us at every moment what's live and what's not. Very valuable in allocating resources, deciding priorities. Okay, this is really important. One touch screen down, not critical, because I got another one, plus I got the paper ballots. So prioritizing using the online form is really critical, saves us enormous time, and we can also then determine if something's fixed. Rumors are very important on election day and can be harmful. And candidates, of course, want to win. And so these rumors start going on, oh my God, the whole precinct is shut down, you got to go. And so, again, the automated call form can tell us, 1017, that was fixed. or 10, 15 state's attorneys showed up and pushed everybody back to the 100-foot rule. So that is one of our most important tools, and that also serves as an important evaluative tool because after the crunch, after 9 o'clock, those people going around visiting polling places, number one, can do an analysis of what's going on, so we could next time, and can also be interviewing or assessing the poll workers, which is critical, because both Charles and Pam said, it's the logistics. If you've got a polling place, and even without a great crowd, but if you've got one person who's checking people in, and they're really slow, you can have all this equipment that's available, but that's a problem. So logistics and common sense are important. So no sense doing that. Yeah, you can go from A to Z. You can make 3 lines, 4 lines, A to F, G to whatever. And you check more people in if that's a particular problem that day. So all that information we collect and then use on election day or use as evaluative tools afterwards helps us to do individualized training for the judges, or what we call judges, what you all call poll workers. And the final thing, so we get all this data, and now we know that, Mary over there in precinct 12, she's had a problem 3 straight elections with this. She's doing the provisionals wrong. Of course, we have that in our training, but we can do individualized training. We can use social media. We can email Mary or her colleagues, here's what you have to do, or else you're out. So these are tools that we use. Doesn't solve everything, but boy, it makes it a lot easier.
Well, that's impressive. It seems to me like leadership in the polling place, right? And well-trained people in those polling places are just vital, because in the end, where the rubber meets the road is in those polling places on election time. How are you recruiting poll workers and training them differently than you have in the past, and empowering them to make decisions, or are you not? Or is it more about having a better system of oversight centrally?
Well, I think David shared some ideas that I think we utilize in Jefferson County. Well, in Colorado, we're reducing the number of judges we need. Delivering a ballot by mail, doing early voting. I'm going from 175 precinct neighborhood polling places to 24 vote centers on election day. And so we're able to recruit and target those skill sets that we need most specifically. But one of the things that I think that I can't stress enough is the user interface. Whether it's your voter or your poll worker or your judge, what are they using to do the job that they have to do? And that is key to your training. We're giving them a lot of information in training, but what are those key things they're going to do in their role as a judge? And that leadership in the polling place, we have supervisors that we're identifying that go through all of the training. We do specific training for certain roles. But we're also keeping an eye out. When you were talking, David, it made me think of the administrative groupthink component. You may have identified your supervisor and your leader in your polling place, and someone else self-identifies themselves as that type A personality that comes out. And so those call centers, those resources that you provide for your judge teams, the parties and interest groups that do this, our community of election geeks, I like to call them, that also give us an idea of what may be going on out there that we haven't heard about, those roving teams with resources, and then building contingencies in for everything you do to prioritize what your election days in our state look like.
A couple of practical things on training poll workers. It's one thing I believe with people like Charles and others and the EAC and all these organizations, there's been enormous resources over the last 10, 12 years. The practical things I believe that helps us. Number one, as technology is more demanding, all of us do various things. We start up with a technical judge. Now we have people that trained to handle the equipment, to troubleshoot the equipment. So they're a little different responsibility than others. Also, when we analyze all these issues, particularly poll workers, we need to make sweeping generalizations, but there's so many differences either among counties or among states. For example, here in Illinois, our parties legally pick the poll workers. Okay, it doesn't happen, I don't think, in Colorado. I'm not sure.
We get our list from the parties that we have to choose from first.
Okay, so they have the right to pick them if they do it. Now, in fact, even in a highly politicized place like Cook County, lots of the committeemen do not pick those judges. But all these things create opportunities and difficulties. when they don't pick the judges, or they pick judges that have no business anywhere near a polling place. Those are challenges for us. I think the bottom line is we have streamlined, we're tougher. You pass the test, you don't work. Didn't be used to case. Everybody passed, okay? You pass the test or you don't work. You improve training. You want those good people that do it every year, but you don't want them hearing the same old boring 3.5-hour thing. So we can use online training, and certain people can gather a lot of their data, understanding the systems, by doing an online training. So we try and have a variety of opportunities. We, like everybody else, particularly because of, let's say, minority and language minorities, we'd get a lot more help in finding judges who perhaps can speak Spanish, speak Chinese, various languages helps us. So the training is considerably better. The accountability is better, as I said earlier, because we can look at every polling place and what happened. And we actually penalize people. They don't make a lot of money. The average judge makes $170 in Cook, much less in parts of Illinois. That's if they go through training. But on the other hand, you show up late and we dock you. I think some of the things that we've done, and particularly the improvement of the training and the judge manual. Every year we bring in judges, they tell us, you know what, can't you do this differently? Things we can change, we change. And every time that I go around to polling places, they tend to appreciate if we can change things to make it a little simpler, because the elections that we're running now are extremely complicated. I couldn't answer half the questions sometimes I think about who can vote and why. So we need to streamline, we need to train, with certain people need more training than others, and we need the accountability so that we can say, sorry, appreciate your good service, but we don't need you to come back. And one last thing, because I don't want to be too negative, is that the other thing we discover all the time is the great folks that are doing good things. Really important, because our goal always is, you know what, I got 1,800 precincts. If I know that 900 of them, great, I don't have to touch them. 400, okay, maybe another 400 I'm worried about. The more we know that there's good judges, good poll workers, they're doing what they're supposed to, they know how to troubleshoot, they can solve problems without our help, that's the goal we want to have.
And not to preview, I'm very interested in the deep dive this afternoon on tools, because one of the things that we're really looking at as well is the transaction time in a polling place, which I think is really vital in trying to estimate how many voters you're going to be processing in a particular location. For a vote center, that's a little bit more challenging to identify and predict without vote history. So the first time we do it, over-engineering is probably a good idea for risk. Our mail ballot delivery also helps with that. We know we've got that going as well. But the transaction to check in a voter and identify the ones that we're going to see in a vote center are most likely, if our provisionals tell you anything, they have an address change, some of the things that we've already talked about around registration. They need an address change. They're a new voter. We now have same-day registration. How long is that transaction versus what you call that routine voter, someone who's appropriately registered, they're just there to have their ballot. Then issuing the ballot at the computer, and then voting the ballot. We have very long and complicated ballots in Colorado. We have an initiative and coordinated election process. So timing each of those things to figure out exactly how long it takes to process a given voter based on the service they need. The first step is, what service do they need, right? How do we know? What are those tools, and using technology to do that is very beneficial.
Okay, well, we're going to go to questions. So anybody who has a question, there's a mic here, come on up. But I'm gonna ask one, and you guys can think about it and answer it at the end. I'd like you, as we think about wrapping up after our questions, to think about this. What would be your 2 items on your wish list of either a new technology development that could help make the polls run better and the lines be shorter, or policy change? So, wish list, top 2. You can do 3 if you want, Charles. Of policy or technical changes that you don't have that you could use. Okay, you, sir.
My question is to David, and I really don't know if you have this problem, but for those of us who vote in the city of Chicago, we do. My question is, why is the party allowed to pick the judges in nonpartisan elections?
It's quite simple. Almost everything we do is determined by state law. Okay, the state law determines, the political parties pick the poll workers. It's kind of like, remember, in our society, the way to make an election supposedly healthy is to have competition among the parties. So Republicans can watch the Democrats and vice versa. So we traditionally have two major parties in Illinois, and that's just a privilege.
What is a nonpartisan election?
Doesn't matter what kind of election it is, you still have to have poll
Why
workers.
is the party allowed to pick the judges in a nonpartisan election?
Because for the law, there's no distinction between nonpartisan. It's an election. So now, for example, here in Illinois, and one of the best groups in our state to push good policy is Legal Women Voters, there's been a lot of attempts to say, well, maybe 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 1 other person. That has not gone anywhere.
Well, that seems to me to be intrinsically unfair to allow the political parties who've opted out of being political parties for a nonpartisan election to pick the judges who actually operate the elections. And I have a problem with that. But like you said, it's the law.
Well, it sounds like we have one thing for the wish list of a policy
That's
change
one, yes.
that you think would make this
That's
work
one
better.
of my wishes.
That's a good,
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My question's for Mr. Stewart, and I went back after especially the 12 election and looked at a lot of the data on lines and those kind of things. One of the things that, and I've heard other academics talk about it, the data, we don't have a lot of cost data. Have you had any chance or any way to generate, is there a relationship in the cost? You talked about the opportunity cost, but what's the cost in shrinking these lines in some of those locations, and what's the cost in where's that at? Because I have a hard time going out and trying to look at what elections cost. I have a hard time figuring it out, and I'm running them. But I'm having a hard time figuring out, how we're comparing on costs in elections. And in Illinois, we have the most expensive elections. We get everything. We have no excuse absentee, we have early voting, and we have at full election day. So the cost is always an overriding issue for us.
Yes. A few things about cost. By the way, I will say on lines, my data have Illinois right about the average of the U.S. And so in terms of lines, at least, things are going well. In terms of being able to find polls and being happy with the polling place, Illinois is either better than average or at average. So Illinois seems to be doing okay. With respect to cost, just to say a couple of things, and I think my colleagues would back me up. I hope they would. And one thing is that we don't know much about costs. And I think that this, as someone who wants us to move into an area such as election administration, is just like thinking about education and the other important areas of public administration. A core fact that one has about any important level of public administration is what it costs. There are not standards, accounting standards about accounting for what it costs to run elections. From what I can tell, there's great heterogeneity in how states and localities keep track of costs. And so I'll kind of punt the answer by saying my experience is we have a hard time figuring out what the costs are. With some colleagues associated with the Presidential Commission, I was involved in a survey of local officials where we asked people, asked local officials nationwide what their budget was over the last election cycle. So based on that, our estimate is that over the election 2-year cycle leading up to 2012, local officials spent a total of about $2 billion. But that's about as granular as we can get. So how much it costs to deploy into the field versus to keep track of the registration, registrations and those sorts of things, we're really at our infancy. The final thing I'll say is that because of cost being a big constraint, one of the things that I just observe informally and would like to be able to quantify is that there's been over the last several years a consolidation of polling places nationwide. And oftentimes this is for cost savings. And in many places around the country, when I've talked to local officials about the consolidation, this has resulted in basically oftentimes, and also pushing into more early voting, this has resulted in taking machines that used to be involved in election day voting and repurposing, say, to early voting. The net result is that a lot of election day polling places are now getting under-resourced in terms of what they need in order to serve early voting. And so, again, if we had better tools about allocation and a better sense of what it actually costs to do things, I think we could make better allocation decisions. So, sorry for punting on the question. But
Yes, sir.
Fascinating morning with what I've been hearing, but I'm still perplexed regarding this disconnect between all of the ambitious things I hear for, quote, implementation, and then this thunderclap of in-between or non-presidential elections, especially here in Cook County. I'm appalled to see declining voter participation, voter registration. So I was wondering, especially when I hear so many different sources are collecting the figures, have there ever been things issued like a watch list or warning or sending out proactive teams to find out why the voters are sitting on their hands or not going to the polls in between elections? Just one observation. Here in Chicago, it's all politics is local. With parking meters and the scandals and the crime rate and the school, you would think there'd be more turnout than on a presidential election if you live here in Chicago. So I was just wondering, are there any proactive steps that the election overseers could take to get in, dig deep, as we're referring to, drill deep as to why this swing is taking place despite the ambitions of implementation?
Good question.
Well, there was a 79% turnout when Harold Washington ran for mayor in 1983. Let me just say quickly on my wish list, I want to say, because some of the people in the room, that because of the activity of some of the leaders in the room, you can raise your hands, but Illinois may get Eric. We're talking about a decent chance of getting Eric, and they may get some kind of grace of same day. It won't be same day in every precinct, but that's being debated as we speak right now. That's why I got the phone on. And a lot of our local
Same
groups.
day registration you're talking about.
What we think if they do it, it will be, you can register on election day if you're not registered, but it'll just be at a few sites. So it's not as good as every precinct. But so the things like that we're moving incrementally, I'm pleased at that. If we could get rid of our long ballot, particularly the 70-some retention judges, that would be a wonderful advancement. And frankly, most of what I do, if I had the magic wand and Axelrod opened the door this morning, it's not in the preview. And I think the Presidential Commission did a great job of getting us to talk about things that we can agree on, Republican, Democrat, and I think that's the push right now. But keep in mind, if we don't also deal with the money in politics, democracy will say bye-bye. So that's really not the focus right now, but you asked me for a wish, and that would be it. Real quickly on your question is, don't make too much noise from the low turnout in March. And we're talking about Illinois, that was the question. True, very low, but remember, there was no contest. Voters are not dumb. There was a contest in the Republican Party, and they voted more. But it was almost no major contests. About 75% were uncontested, and most of the contested ones were like the governor, but he had no real challenge. Dick Durbin, the senator, no real challenge. Tony Preckwinkle, the president of the county board, no challenge at all. So you watch in November, the turnout will go way back up. But a lot of states have a problem in primaries, and there's a lot of academic research on that. But some people don't like to declare their parties, and we have not found a way to resolve that yet.
I think our experience in Colorado is similar. We do a coordinated election in odd year November, so local jurisdictions can come to the county and have them administer the election, so the voters getting a single ballot with multiple local race issues on it. And you know, my experience has been that's a lower turnout election, that's a lower interest election. I agree with you all, politics is local, and it seems like it should be the reverse, but that's not been my experience with humans in elections administration. but ballot content matters, and we had our highest turnout November election in 2013, and it was because marijuana taxation and school funding was on the ballot, and it brought people from all sides of the
Were they
political,
Maybe they were connected.
you know, a
Yeah,
direct
is that where the
connection to
money went?
higher ed. This was K-12. Let's hope not.
Okay,
There's your answer.
Your wish list. Speed
My
round.
my wish list is all my dreams came true this past year.
Is that when the marijuana was on? Sorry.
For
No
election-
comment. I walked right into that one. Well, you know, we provide a lot of options for voting in Colorado, and we just got major election reform that allows us to put our resources where our voters are, and that's delivering a mail ballot, doing vote centers early voting through Election Day, and being able to modify their registration or register to vote through Election Day. And I think we're going to be an interesting laboratory for elections administration from here through the presidential election. Particularly, we have a commission that'll be looking at it, because we don't just pass policy in Colorado. We want to look at it and make sure we're doing it well, and that implementation piece is really, really important.
All right, all your wishes came true. Charles.
Two things, one on technology and one on relationships. The technology is motivated by this. We have about 1 million people who work the polls on Election Day as judges, poll workers, and whatnot. And although this group gets a bad rap for a lot of reasons, it's also probably the greatest show of civic engagement in this nation, and I think it's a great thing. Unfortunately, we set up many of these people to fail. So it seems to me we need to start thinking about our poll workers the same way that McDonald's thinks about the pimply-faced kids who take your order, right? They are not particularly well qualified by education, perhaps, but McDonald's makes sure, embeds them in a sophisticated data gathering and dissemination effort, and gives them a lot of information at the point of sale. So it's a long wind up to say, I wish, one of the things on my wish list is moving from thinking about electronic poll books to thinking about an electronic, almost point-of-sale device that not only records registration, but also provides poll workers with instructions and other just-in-time information about how to deal with the complexities of voting on Election Day. So think about the technology and empowering and enabling these roughly amateur poll workers. Thing number one. Thing number two, everywhere I go, I encourage greater partnerships between academics, universities, and state and local election officials. Those are two, sort of like the farmer and the cowman can be friends. These are two communities that oftentimes don't get along with each other, but I think they can, and if they do, I think we can help each other out.
Well, thank you. That wraps it up. And men, what's the next step? Lunch next door. All right, we're getting out of here a couple of minutes early, so we'll see you next door. Oh.